This is the Lean Construction Blogs Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories, case studies, and lessons learned of applying lean construction from around the world. Join Dick Beyer as he interviews industry leaders, lean construction practitioners, and subject matter experts to help you improve the build environment in general and your design and construction projects in particular, advance your lean journey, and bring your continuous improvement efforts to the next level. Let's get started.
Good day, everybody. This is Dick Beyer with the Lean Construction Blog.com podcast. And today on the podcast, we are honored to have one of the leading lights in the lean community and in the actually thought leadership for how projects are actually done in the world and done better. And I'm proud to call him a good friend, Victor Sanvido. Victor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you for the kind intro. Let's see if we can live up to it.
I could go on and on, but we might as well get started. So, Victor, you're originally from South Africa.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about growing up over there. I think that would interest folks who have spent most of their life in downtown Chicago.
Well, it's a little bit different. I grew up in a country that was, had severe racial challenges. We had many different race groups in the country, and one of them ran the country, and the other folks were, let's just say, less privileged, and the degree of privilege depended really on the color of your skin and what tribe you belong to. But essentially, it was a setting that sort of showed me how lucky it was to be who I was. And I grew up with a lot of privilege. I had running water, I had electricity, I had, there was law and order in the town I lived in. I could go to school, I went to university. Everything I did was noticed. And so it was extremely fortunate for me to land there. And a lot of the things that I learned were taught to me by people who had absolutely significantly less privilege than I had. They lived in extremely poor neighborhoods. They lived in places where death was fairly common. They lived hand to mouth. I'm forever grateful for those folks for what they taught me along the way, and they didn't need to, but they did.
That's phenomenal. I mean, I grew up obviously a quintessential white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male myself, and I've never forgotten that when I look in the mirror in the morning, I don't see any impediments to me going forward, and I've always wanted to be part of the team of people that leveled that playing field, so that you could feel like you could compete against everybody. Because if we discriminate against any portion of the population, women, we lose 50% of our resources. African Americans, we lose 15% of our resources. We would lose the Henry Nutts of the world, and the people have been really championed. So thanks for starting with that. It's a powerful way to begin. But somehow you ended up in America.
Yeah, I grew up in my father's family-owned company, and folks taught me the trade. And two things I learned there: people wanted to work, and they wanted to be productive. And so what we did is every day I would go out on the road and I'd set a brick where people had to get to, and if you hit that, then you made your day's wages, and if you went past, you got a bonus. And the guys in my crew used to, we'd get 2-3 hours bonus a day because that was the right thing to do. It wasn't exactly legit what I was doing, but that's the way we got work done. But they made more money, and we got work done quicker. So that's always stuck with me: is how do we let people know where they got to get to that day, and how do we reward them for that progress? I attended University of Cape Town. Mike Forster was my professor there. I went to the wrong class one day. It was about studying in America. And so I filled out a form, and three universities. I wrote to three universities. One of them responded, and that faculty member came over to teach in a program at Cape Town. He interviewed me, and I came to America. First time I ever got on a plane, flew to America.
Wow. And it was a long plane trip, too. You didn't warm up with a 30-minute coffee hopper.
No, it was long.
So was that Stanford or was that Berkeley, or where did you end up going?
I went to Stanford University, and Boyd Paulson was the person who ultimately became my mentor over there. But, if it weren't for him, I wouldn't be anywhere close to where I am today.
Did that motivate you to a more academic career, or focus you on trying to get the trade right, or how did it motivate you? What did you get out of that, other than maybe satisfying your native curiosity?
Well, I came over to learn about construction, and I did the master's program for a year. And then I played rugby, and we were going on tour to Australia, so I wanted to stay eligible. So I signed up for another degree, and went over and toured Australia, had a good old time. Then I actually met Greg Howell the third week in the program. He was an evening speaker, and he was talking about productivity improvement and building a project, the James Bay hydroelectric power system. And I said, look, I'd like to work for you this summer. And he kind of looked at me and he says, okay, how do we make that happen? And because I didn't have a work permit or anything, so I knew we worked all that out. Ended up working on Glenn Ballard's job at Richmond Lube Oil Refinery. So that was my introduction to that group of people. And there was Parker Oglesby, who co-authored the first book with Greg. There was John Fondal, who developed the CPM scheduling technique. So we had a rich group of people, faculty and people in that environment, which sort of led me to, into the field I'm in now.
That was very serendipitous. It has sparked lifelong relationships with some of the other really key people that have been thinking about the same kinds of productivity improvements and overall effectiveness of how we are planning procedures and our implementation procedures and the rest of that. So that must have been great. Greg claimed that he was a rugby player, and I know Will Lichtig, another light in our community, played rugby. So is there something about playing rugby that just makes you more determined to find an answer, or more dedicated to keeping your head down and running into walls?
Well, it's the ultimate team sport, and you have to be able to tolerate. You have to have a high threshold of pain and be able to tolerate it for 80 minutes without substitutions when we played.
So it's very much like construction.
You get to build a little bit of perseverance, But there's a great community amongst rugby players, and even your fierce opponents, you tend to always appreciate what the other person has done, and you play harder against the people you respect.
Fantastic. I was a college lacrosse player, and I thought there was nothing better than boys with sticks chasing balls, and that was a lot of fun. I think it's important that you gain a healthy respect for what you can do physically as well as mentally, so that there's a good balance, almost a platonic balance between your sportsmanship and your thought creativity and your performance. So did you return to South Africa after Stanford, or did you where did you go?
I worked in the oil field in Alaska for a year and a half, I think it was, with Standard Oil of Ohio. And we were building the modules in the lower 48 and shipping them up there. I think the biggest modules we did were 2,400 tons, welded them onto barges, took them up, set them in the oil field, and you had to get the barges out before it froze up. So you had 6 weeks to get in and get out. So it required a little bit of planning. And it would cost us what we could do in 1 hour in the low 48 would take 5 hours up in Alaska to do the same scope of work, because a large part of your year was adverse weather conditions. Then
were these housing units and research units and like the entire village of what happens in an oil field?
We had 75,000 people up there. On the project, and there were I think we had 4 jets flying people in and out every day, because you had to rotate people through the locations. But we were building gathering centers, well pad facilities, pump stations, and then we also had our own fire station, sewage treatment plant, living quarters, maintenance sheds. But it was a whole city up there.
Amazing. And so after Alaska, when you decided to head back to warmer climes, what was the next stop in your journey?
So the idea was to go back to South Africa and play a role in the family business. We were there for probably a year or so, and then the military gave me an exemption. They decided to change their mind on that, so I didn't really want to go and walk on landmines in Angola. So I thought, we got a family, we need to get out of here. So we came back to the U.S. and I ended up working at Penn State. And the reason we chose it was we could raise our family on one income in a college town. And, when the kids are young, their characters are set when they're 8 years old. So, how do we give them the best chance? So that's what we decided as a family.
Have you completed your PhD by then, or were you just still working?
I did the PhD, and I started at Stanford in 81, and I got a master's, and I got an engineer the next year, and I got a PhD in 84. So, it was a mercenary mission for me. It wasn't to fall in love with research. I just went there to get done and play rugby.
Perfect. It worked out, actually. Yeah. So your years at Penn State have produced lots of interesting people in our community. Mark Conshore, Bevan Mace, Kathy Copeland, a number of people that went through your program. Andreas Phelps, I think, went through your program as well. Tell us a little bit about what your, it was called architectural engineering, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. So I went to the program. It was architectural engineering, and I taught the construction management. The construction engineering and management, I think, was the official name. Had about 500 undergrads during that time, and got involved with making sure they were exposed to the industry. And I figured, we'd have a little discussion in the beginning of senior year and say, hey, why are you here? And everyone was to get an education. It's no, you're here to get a job. And that's why your parents sent you here. And you're here to have a career with a company where your culture fits. And it's all about, creating your career in your life. It's not so much, education's cute, but it's more important that you're a productive member of society when you leave here. And then we also had a bunch of those folks. We had a research program that we developed, the Computer Integrated Construction Research Program. And we turned out our Penn State started the PhD program in AE, and we had, people like John Messner, who's now on the board of LCI, Kobe Kuntz, Dave Riley, Ted Lynch, who's now my boss, he's our CEO, Mark Conshaw, Bevan Mace, they all came through the program, and they were all working on ways to improve the process, right? So we did process modeling, and then Mark and a team of 8 people did the study on comparing delivery systems, design, build, see at risk, and design, bid, build. And they sort of provided data that we were able to get the law changed in the US to allow design, build. And that study was used to change the laws in several states.
It was funny that that the laws needed to change, and the same with IPD. You needed to get statutory authorization within states so that people were doing IPD. I remember Michael Bidet was doing a glorified design build with an IPD team inside as the design build team in order to build some of his hospitals out at the University of California and San Francisco. So you told me earlier that your process modeling seemed to be the natural extension of the work that Greg and Glenn had been working on. And say a little more about that.
So if you look at a typical input process output controller model that they, in fundamental in systems engineering, the process is whatever that person is doing. So the foreman might be looking after a crew. The general foreman might be looking after a bunch of foremen. The superintendent might be looking after a bunch of GFs. And then your general superintendent might be coordinating work across the overall site. Now, each of those work entities, crews or companies or area leads, are basically taking inputs. They need materials, tools, equipment, temporary work, safe space to work in. There were 8 of them that we identified. They have to be distributed amongst all the people, and those people have to produce their work, and that work has to be coordinated into a product that's of value to the owner. We also found that, CPM scheduling was, people would use the CPM essentially as a procurement tool. And when you observe what happened on the site, people planned and they bought stuff. And when the stuff came to site, that's when the superintendent would go and say, what can I do next? What do I need? And that's how they would plan their work. And so you essentially had a bring resources to the site function, and then what can I do next? And what resources are available? And I think, that kind of stuff got formalized later on as what we might call a last planner system today. And I'm not saying, I'm saying there were lots of people working on this. There must have been 8, 10, 12 people working on it. But it really came down to, Howell and Ballard were the people who were coordinating a lot of that stuff.
Oh, it's interesting when you're talking about the number of inputs that go into the people who are part of the production team, that suggest that there are also a number of outputs. And I remember Laurie Koskela talking about the input-output theory of production, the transformation theory of production, the flow theory. So how did the things that Laurie was talking about with Glenn and Greg and Iris and some of the other luminaries, how did that fit into your process modeling?
So our earlier modeling was in the 84, 85. That was before those guys came along. And then later, they were working in that area. What we worked on, we looked at what is the process to deliver a project. So there's definite functions which are managing, which is what the owner does. They manage all the resources to bring us to bear. There's planning, which some people might call programming and validation. There's a design phase, there's a construction phase, and an operations phase. And then we mapped out at lower levels, what are all those generic functions in there? And then all of the folks that went through the research program were working on different aspects of it. Some people worked on design builds, some worked on precast concrete structures. We did some work with Fujita Corporation in Japan that John Messner was deeply involved in. So there was a lot of applying that model to the way we think about work. And that influenced then a bunch of research projects and theses.
And I think it also influenced Todd Zabel and James Chow and that team in terms of their production planning, that they went on to create production plans around. Is that a fair statement?
I don't know if it influenced them or not, but I think when you look at the Glenn and Greg show, essentially there were a collection of people who were around them, and some people went down the right river bank, and some people went down the river, and some went down the left bank, and some went over a mountain, but they all were looking at the same things, and everybody found different ways to address this issue, and those things showed up as a series of practices and tools. And when you look back at it and say, fundamentally a lot of these things are very similar, we just got there different ways.
What's really interesting to me is that here's a collection of smart people that are all encouraged by both the research and the outcomes of what you guys were doing, whether it's process planning or last planner or production planning or whatever the different tools might have been, SciFi and ICE and all these different ways of thinking about things in a more collaborative fashion.
Right.
And yet the industry just seems to have completely ignored it, and still has its struggles trying to deliver things in any kind of a reliable fashion if they don't use these tools. And it's not 100% of the industry that is actually using those more collaborative process model tools. Even effective use of BIM and the rest of those things is still in its infancy.
I think these tools, there are some people who are what I call tool heads, and they just like, I got a tool, let me use it for everything I do. But if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's not useful. I think you use the tools to build a collaborative culture. And when you realize the job is bigger than you and bigger than your company, and there's a significant, everybody can add value. And my grandfather always said to me, Two heads are always better than one, even if one's a cabbage. I remember him loud and clear. Everybody has something to offer. And so you better make sure you bring all those people into the discussion and, utilize the brain power and utilize the heart. There's two parts to it. There's the brain and there's the heart. The heart's the determination, the brain is the ideas. And you need both to get there.
Sounds very much like a rugby coach. You need to have the physical ability, but you also have to have that deep desire to get out there and perform at your highest level.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we have as these statistics have developed, as Paul Techholtz delivered his information on productivity, which was early in the 2000s. So you were working on this stuff in the mid 80s. Howell and Ballard and Lori Koskela and Iris and the rest of them were really in the 90s-ish beginning to see this stuff through IGLC and lots of influence from around the world. What have you seen in terms of your work at Penn State? How did that morph into developing these more collaborative cultures, other than maybe through the people that you sent out there? I mean, the great evangelist. I mean, Concher was very much kind of in your mold. I mean, he's a Hall of Fame hockey player at Penn State, which is kind of rugby on ice, and has that same kind of. He's taken that collaborative spirit into Balfour Beatty. How did you try to influence people at Penn State to take that into the industry?
Well, I think Penn State had an architectural engineering program that I worked in, and it was well established. And they had essentially people learned about architecture, structures, mechanical, electrical, lighting, construction management, contracting. So you learned a whole bunch of skills, then you specialize in one of those. So essentially the education system of an architectural engineer is one that exposes you to the other trades that you're going to be working with. And when you do projects and people are working, you realize that other people have solutions, even though initially you think, yeah, they don't know what they're doing. But then when you actually figure out and find a common language to communicate in, you find that everybody can add some value. It's a matter of asking the questions in the right way, using the right language. And I think that's just fundamentally in the AE curriculum, and you can see the same at the other schools that have been influenced by that Penn State program. You look at University of Nebraska, similar thing. People from those programs understand that there are other skill sets, and everyone has to survive in this industry. And the other thing we try to do at the company too now is, hey, if we're on the job and we can't make life better for the owner, for the general contractor, and for the other trade partners, then are we really collaborating? If we just optimize our piece, is that really it? And I think it's important. Everybody has to be able to contribute to the process, and you got to be able to bring the right people in at the right time. I don't even answer your question. I'm just kind of rambling.
No, that was perfect. Because it segues into this idea that I think everybody has different ideas about whether the Toyota way is foundationally responsible for some of the things we do. And you remember we had Jeff Leiker on our board for about 2 sessions until he decided, wow, I have no idea what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the fundamental lesson of lean, regardless of the industry that you're in, is the focus on value. And that's focusing not only on the value of your resources and the people, but on the value that you're delivering for the owner. So as you moved out of Penn State and you got a little more deeply involved with LCI in its infancy and those guys, where did you next move to, and what did you and how did you leverage that experience at Penn State to help you?
In 2000, I went joined Southland Industries. I had been in. I knew the CEO very well. He was from Allentown. Him and his wife, and my wife and I became friendly. So I ended up joining Southland Industries in 2001. I'd been on their board of advisors since I think it was about 1990. And what I noticed is it's a very collaborative company, and LCI was starting. Okay, let's go. And, we'd spent some time in DBIA when it was founded and moving on, and then found that maybe Lean had an operating system to offer. So we got engaged over there and we started doing Lean work. And we didn't pay much attention to LCI at that point in time because we were doing, the Fairfield MOB, which was Sutter's first IFOA and the first one in the country. And then we did Van Ness and Geary, and then we were engaged with, Bill Seed at UHS, and then the Disney work with Craig and those guys, and then we got engaged a bit with Intel. So it was customer to customer, and we were engaged. And then all of a sudden we saw, LCIs over there, and we kind of didn't participate that much. But then we noticed it was pretty stuck. Every year people went to Boulder and did the thing. We went a couple times, and one day Mark and I were there, and we said, hey, Lean means a lot to our organizations. How do we get this beyond 90 people and make it more mainstream in the US? So what do we have to do? And we were driving. It was about 5 a.m, leaving for a flight to Denver, and there were a couple of big elk standing in the road we almost hit. And I remember that clearly because we were having that discussion, got a little bit distracted. But so I think at that point in time, how do we help the organization? Because I could tell, Greg and, he wanted to get it to a different place, but it hadn't sort of reached the critical mass yet to make it into the industry. So I felt an obligation, since he did so much to help me. We got to see if we can lend a hand over here.
It was fun back in those Boulder days at the Boulderado or where that hotel was, where you had 80 people wearing Birkenstocks and old sweaters that smelled like wood smoke, and really did feel like a kind of hippie reunion at some point in time, and until people started taking it seriously, and we were able to bring the light out from under the basket, which was one of your great contributions, getting on the board at LCI and recognizing that, having a bunch of consultants sit around and talk about how cool it would be if people were different wasn't really feeding the bulldog. So how did you, you and Concher and Bevan Mace all got deeply involved in LCI as a commitment to what was happening there, and actually had a pivotal role in transforming it from just kind of an intellectual chat box, roundtable, to something pretty dynamic.
Well, they were doing good work. I mean, they would do good work to try to move the ball and develop new tools, and there was a lot of intellectual stuff going on, but it had to become practical and scalable. And I would say there were a lot of other people. So, but maybe let me back up a little bit. When we had some events happened in the early 2000s in the US, which made it clear for me what to do. I joined the company, and we had some litigation, and we were doing design build work, and we're doing design bid build. We went to Jim Collins up in Boulder, and he basically looked at what we're doing, and he said, you guys do really well in this design build stuff, but this design bid build stuff, you take everything you made and you pay to do that stuff, and why do you even do the stuff? If you didn't do it, you'd be better off. And he sort of came up with this idea of focus and, the hedgehog. What is that one thing you do well? What can you be world-class at? And how do you do it? And so it really gave us a perspective of focusing on what we could be good at, and then not filling our time by doing this adversarial work. So collaboration, and, we were an engineering company. So coming up with engineered solution to fabricate things and to deliver them in a lean manner in the field was fundamental to us. So we were able to make that transition. And when I looked at LCI, we said, how do we approach it with a little bit of discipline? What is that thing we can be good at? And it was to create the conversation between the different industries, the different industry groups, and to try to remove waste from the process. And the first thing you need is some owners there, because the owners spend the money. And if you aren't influencing the right owners, it doesn't really matter. So we tried to get the owners who had influence in the industry. It wasn't just a series of on policy level people, we put them together. We tried to get them to come to some of our kickoff conferences, and we had Craig Russell from Disney there. We had Bill Seed. We had that group of Michael Bidet. You had that group of 6 or 8 owners that were just moving the industry forward in a meaningful way. So they had to be in the board. We had to get some contractors, and the requirement was we wanted CEOs because this thing was fragile, and we may have to have people there who can stroke a check to get us through the first year or two. And then we had a couple of trade partners and a couple of architects. And I would say the people, in those people, I'd asked Tom Solnick to join. He was CEO of Rosen at the time, but he had been chair of DBIA. We had Dave Crawford, who was CEO of Sunt, and he'd also chaired DBIA. Chuck Greco was CEO of Lindbeck, and Leo Lindbeck wrote the first check for LCI. He was also in the leadership in AGC. We had a collection of people, Will Lichtig, who had written the contract, the first IFOA contract. We had Mark Conchar in there, who did the design build study. We had Michael Bidet, John Pemberton from Intel, Craig Beal, and then Jeff Stouffer from HKS. So and there were many other people. This was 12 people on the board, and then we rotated people through. But we had people on the board who had to say, if LCI fails, our company will be harmed. And that's a perfect alignment. That's how DBI did really well. When they started, they picked people who had skin in the game. This market had to do well. So our focus was, let's first of all, good old Tom, man, he'd say, let's get financially healthy. And in 2 years, we had 2 years of reserves in the bank. And that's when, we were able to commit to directors and all that. And you played a great role in helping us through that sort of time.
As much fun as I've ever had, actually.
I'm not the most diplomatic person, and some diplomacy was needed. And, unfortunately, I hope not too many people felt bad about it, but survival was number one. And, politics was not even on the list.
I felt pretty good that we built a really good consensus moving from the board that had been to the new board, and without many hurt feelings, and we still had a ton of support from those folks, because even as consultants, we were generating the intellectual mana, if you will, for them to be able to go out and do their coaching and the rest of that stuff. And it did catch wildfire. So it was a great time. I just remember having a conversation with you and Chuck and Will in a hotel room someplace, saying, okay, this is what we have to do. This is the transit. This is the time for the transition. So it was great. But a lot of that was built, a lot of the owner relationships were built on the fact that you had your owners conference in your office in Garden Grove, where you invited some of those folks from Southern California just to come in and chat amongst the owners. No notes, no minutes, no accountability, just free form, which became the owners forum, and it became very much replicated on what you had proposed, that people don't get to sit in on the owners forum, so the owners can talk freely amongst themselves about what they need.
The key thing for that is it always had to be about what's best for the industry. Second, what's best for the owner, and third, what's best for everybody else. But we really had to maintain discipline, because every now and then you get someone in there who wants to use it for their own, for their own benefit. But I would say I can't recall anybody in that group that ever did that. There are a lot of people still today from that original group that are still trying to do things to help make the industry better. And at the end of the day, if you do that, everything else will take care of itself.
I think two of the really seminal moments in the history of the lean community were the California prison receivership project, which a lot of people date their credentials back to. Were you on CPR? If you were, then you're in, and if you weren't, it's kind of like, well, you're gonna have to prove yourself a bit. And then to that original, first renewal board that we started with, because the board thereafter kept getting people that looked like them, as opposed to giving into the usual suspects that industry associations get into, revenue creation and the rest of that. So I think LCI stayed. I have a few suggestions for them, but I think that they carved out what we wanted to do, which was to be the voice of lean in the industry, and I think they still hold that position.
Yeah, I mean, it's a volunteer group, right? And so I respect people that volunteer their time to do things for the industry, and they are empowered right now, and they're choosing a direction that makes sense for them and the industry as they see it, right? Because we're going out the back door here into the compost heap, and the new folks are coming in, and you got to make it relevant to today's people.
That's for sure. So, your experience at Southland, bouncing back and forth between LCI and your teaching and all the rest of that stuff. Nonetheless, I think your experience at Southland and Southland's performance over the last decade and more has been really setting a high watermark for teams in terms of innovation, in terms of value creation, in terms of really understanding what your role is in the system that puts together buildings that can be operated in an effective manner. So tell us a little bit about how you segued, or how the company has shifted based on that deep lean learning. I remember being in your Garden Grove office when you went from cubicles to this incredibly wide open space, 10 years before anybody was doing wide open office spaces and very collaborative spaces. And that must have had an influence on the company and your direction and your success as well.
Well, I think, first of all, our lean journey has been bumpy. People tell you a story about how it was, and like for every success, every two successes you have, you one setback, and how you handle those setbacks is probably important. And I think, culturally, it's about being collaborative, working with your partners, and not being a victim, right? You rise up above your circumstances and figure it out. So I think we started off in our shops, visual management, pull planning, which then pulls back into your detailing or your modeling, which pulls back into engineering. If you look at how we did trades, over time, we did sheet metal first, and then the piping guys would get in the way, so we started doing piping, and then the plumbers would get on the job first, so we got into plumbing, and then the sprinkler people would come up and mess with our ceiling coordination, so we started self-performing fire protection, and and then more recently electrical on a limited scale. But essentially what you try to do is identify the bottlenecks and to try to move forward and work with partners, where you've got great partners. We have some fabulous electrical partners, some fabulous framing partners. We'll work with them all day long. But when there's a void, you have to fill the void. So how do we decrease our risk, and how do we control that bottleneck and that flow of work? So we start in the shops then with partners. Engineering, we're probably the 20th largest engineering company if we just took our engineers out and stand alone in the US. So we made a significant investment in that. We started, using lean on non-lean jobs, and we started, doing a lot of IFO8. We've probably done 100 IFO8 projects in the country right now, which is not a lot, but it's significant because a lot of them are the big ones. Excuse me. So we've been fortunate and had that exposure in the field. Now, when we looked at the company, we said, where's the waste? Well, the first thing was our headquarters. So we got rid of that. What does the headquarters do? Nothing, right? It's a place a bunch of people sit and they're removed from the work. So we were suggesting ideas. Gee, it'd be nice if you had this. And we were creating initiatives for people who didn't need them, but we thought they were good. So we got rid of that activity, and everyone's distributed. The leadership's distributed around the country, and then they get together, once a month in a different location. So we try to keep our feet on the ground, visit the jobs, work with the teams. In terms of business planning, our strategy for each business unit fits on an A3. If it's bigger than an A3, then you need to go back and figure out what matters. Our strategy in terms of, getting the work is pretty straightforward. It's develop your owners, enable your partners, act as one company. That's it. There's nothing else to it. And then each business unit sort of figures out how they're going to do that. And then the financials, it's a sheet of paper. That's your financials. And that's our planning. So each business unit then is much like a trade partner on an IFOA. And then we put an R&O log together for the company, because the worst thing you can do is push people into targets that make them take risks that they're not qualified or don't have the skill set to take. And so then you get the hockey stick effect as the year goes on. We're going to make it all back in the last month. So we found by exposing the R&O, we pull people from across the company to attack those issues. And it's working like an IFOA, because you essentially, if it's good enough for a job, it's good enough for the company. So we started working in that direction, and it's made it a lot more transparent. A lot more people have say in what's going on, and that's from 2000 on. It's an evolution. It's not. We didn't have like one day this happened. These things sort of evolved, and we run off a lot of dashboards that are fairly simple, looking at trends. Prevention through design is a big deal. How do we design safety into the work? DFMA matters, designing for manufacturing and assembly. That requires us to invest in manufacturing spaces that are not typical for us. That requires us to develop devices for handling those materials. Just do it with a chain follower crane. We use airport tuggers to move big pipe around, because they're below center of gravity. They pull airplanes around. Well, they can pull big pieces of pipe and big racks. We've got special attachments on forklifts for rotating things. With the theory on manufacturing is one truck, one pick. So you put a few things in like that. We make a lot of mistakes. Hopefully we get more things right. Hopefully we catch the mistakes earlier. We simplified our initiatives from 22. We have 3. And when you get them done, we can have another one. But those 3 have been the same for 3 or 4 years. And so we're trying to get really simple and focused on what matters. But I would say and it all starts with our CEO. Ted has done a hell of a job at empowering people to do stuff, keeping things simple, being transparent. And we're trying to make sure that everybody's opinion is heard. And then when the decision is made, okay, guys, let's line up and go do the job. So that's a long story. It sounds like it's smooth and well organized, but you make a lot of it up as you go, and you make some mistakes. But at the end of the day, I think it works better.
Well, the one factor that's always kind of the wild card is that you're dealing with people, right? And you never know who's going to show up on what day and who's not. And so the previous podcast that should be up on the website here soon is with Daniel Pink, who talks a lot about motivation and intrinsic value and those kinds of things. And it seems like you've found a pretty good sweet spot inside the company for doing a number of those things. Lots of your people have gone on to do pretty amazing things. Christian Piquel, my partner at the Realignment Group, has been a thought leader in the community. Kathy Copeland and Jessica went off to Merck, and so you've been able to place people with your good work. What, as you look back on it, well, actually, I have a question. I was a sheet metal apprentice in 1969, and I was bending gutter and installing it on roofs and swamp coolers on factories. Do you still have a bending machine?
We do.
Awesome.
If you think about what we do, we buy things, we cut them, and we join them. That's what we do. And then we take them out and we put them in. And the fundamental, the owner gets no value unless the person in the field installs the work. So we're all about the field. How do we support the people out there doing the work? The rest of us exist to support those people, and that's goes all the way through the company.
I think that's quintessential servant leadership, right? I mean, your people can only do as well as you help them do, right? The things that they need, the supplies that they need, the cutters that they need, the installation stuff they need. If it's not top of mind, one of the greatest wastes that we've always had in construction is the guy who has to go back to his truck to pick up a screwdriver. I mean, just solving that problem you'd think it would be a pretty fundamentally easy problem to solve, but it's proven bothersome. So you guys have been known as a very innovative company. You've done all kinds of interesting things with server farms and big industrial complexes and stuff. Are there any innovations that come top of mind that you can say, oh, this was fantastic because it turned something around? Or has your innovation just been a natural evolution of finding ideas in people that you've been able to tap into?
I think there's a couple types of innovations. The first one is when we have a crisis, we innovate. All right. And that crisis could be you've got to compete to win a project. You have something go bad on a job. That forces you to solve the problem. And it's not sustainable if you have too many of those. But you do need some of those crises. I mean, we've developed brand new products to solve problems. I mean, that was the innovation, right? We can't do this. We got to do it a different way. Fan power induction boxes was something we developed to solve a challenge on a 4 million square foot building, and it had to be solved. And if we didn't solve it, we wouldn't have the work. So we did that. The other ones, and I think there are several of those things, in terms of 100% outside air solutions for healthcare. The critical item was solving the heat recovery wheel, they're not getting cross-contamination in the air. And our engineers worked on that and solved it. And it made a big difference in us, because now when we fabricating, when you have 2 ducts in the ceiling rather than 3, you don't have supply, exhaust, and return. You just have supply and exhaust, but you've got to be able to take the heat out. You've got to be able to recover the heat and transfer it. But that innovation, we were doing it 15, 20 years before the conventional industry, who is risk averse. Not all of them, some people were doing it, but a lot of people were not doing it because, it's something new, right? We haven't done it before, but you've got to do what's right for the industry first. I think the second one is really individuals. And the one that comes back is one of Henry's folks in Northern Cal went out for lunch, and those McDonald's straw dispensers, you push them down, the straw rolls forward. He came back and said, I'm getting a lot of people getting injured on cast iron. So he built a system of those to distribute cast iron pipe for the cutting shop. And I'm looking at, who the hell came up with that idea? That's someone who went out and they were thinking. And every day there's something like that. And those little innovations, you've got to do those every day, because that's what keeps the juices flowing. The crises come and go, and you have no control over that. But the little ones are what you can do each day, and you build a culture of that. And just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean we can't do it. I mean, one of our guys couldn't move the pipe, right? With the forklifts, were too high. We weren't getting the traction. He said, let's go to the airport and get some air tuggers. I mean, somebody did that. Someone had the courage to do it. And that's what you need in your company. It's not a big innovation, but it's something that made a big difference on that job.
One of the things that Greg used to talk about was low associative barriers. Seeing this on the right and saying, why wouldn't we do that on the left? And it's very much like the straw dispenser and the idea that, those tractors that push the planes around. they stay grounded. The plane doesn't flip them up in the air. They must be must be doing something
Yeah.
right. I think those are the opportunities that you have, is to be able to make those associations and then get them back into the company somehow. I mean, people see things all the time that they're afraid to raise, and so I think it's the company you have created, and you have to create a culture of sharing those experiences. That no idea is a terrible idea. I mean, there are some terrible ideas, like apartheid was not a good idea and things like that. But in terms of innovation in industry, there's really very few ideas that shouldn't be at least voiced and listened to. One of the things that I'm seeing is that some of the original lean pioneers, especially in Northern California and in California, have seemed to regress back to a more traditional GC. These are mostly general contractors and construction managers. They seem to have regressed a bit back to that kind of more traditional mold. And the question is, as you move into the lean area, a general contractor who doesn't perform any work on a project really has to establish a value proposition for themselves being there. So have you seen any of that kind of stuff? Have you seen new value propositions being asserted by general contractors out there to be really more than just organizing a herd of unruly cats?
I mean, I think I see three things. One is some general contractors are trying their hand at fabrication. And, I know how long it took us to learn that. So I think that's going to be a difficult road. But I think it's a worthwhile one. And I think, when we have people, to fabricate, you can't fabricate a lot of things. You got to specialize in a couple of things till you get really good, then you add a new one. And so I think some of that is healthy. And I think the other one is there's a collection of general contractors that are trying to act as the sort of the information source. And so that suite of tools they bring to the table to optimize information flow. The one concern I have is sometimes we're automating waste, automating RFIs. Well, if you did the job right, you wouldn't need RFIs. So why are we automating that? So I think there needs to be some sort of filter on that. Are we automating things that add value, or are we just automating waste? And I think some people are doing it really well, and some people are just doing it because everyone else is doing it. And then I think the third group of people are those general contractors that are sort of closely held and, in the $1 to $3 billion range. And they have to compete against the bigger contractors. And so they're finding innovative ways to show themselves being a big company, basically by teaming with, strategically teaming for pursuits with the specialty contractors that can bring that big look and feel. And then, and we're seeing that quite a bit. And they're actually, the owner says to them, well, you need to buy these people. You need to go through and have another procurement cycle. I said, no, this is our team. Take it or leave it. And we're seeing a lot of that happening more recently as the market's getting busier. And so I think, everybody is trying to innovate in their area. There's probably tens of other things, but the ones that seem to be moving are innovating in, strategic alliances and teaming. Secondly is, I would say, is the automation of the information. And thirdly is some of the fabrication, but fabricating the right stuff. So I look at a company like Clark Pacific, where they precast. They're trying to take precast and put more and more stuff into it. They've become the long pole in the tent now on certain projects, because they're the ones who have the technology that can make the shapes that the owners want on their buildings. And I think creating that competitive advantage, how do you become the long pole in the tent? So you need to be there on day one.
So one of the things that I have been encouraging owners, and I spoke at LCI last year about this, is that is that owners need to demand better from the supply chain, and I'm not sure that they know how to. I certainly don't know how to, but I did posit it for them to say, look, if all you're getting are, hard bid build contractors, or you're getting people who are, we got this, we don't need you kind of people, you just need to demand better responses to what you're trying to build out there, because as you know, 25 years ago, it begins and ends with the owners. The owners are the customers, they are the consumers, and we know that consumers have some power in marketplaces. So is that anything that you've seen with the owners that you've worked with? Are they, engaged in trying to change the conversation, try to change the availability of resources for themselves?
I think there definitely are those that are, serial builders that have a steady workflow. They definitely are engaging in that. Um, if you look at Sutter Health and Digby, I mean, he's always looking for new ways to do stuff, and he's engaging his community and he's pushing forward, and he's got a good portfolio of work. And he's an example, right? But he's been around for a long time. James is doing his stuff at UCSF. I think some owners have purchased and the market has changed on them, so they may not be buying as much. But we're seeing a lot of the mission critical manufacturing and the teaching hospitals buying in a more sensible way, because they've got so much more at stake. Some people who are building one job here and there, they may or may not think about construction as something that's one of their core activities. So they like, I just need someone to do this for me, get it done. But those people who buy on a repeat basis and care about the cost of construction and what the shape of the building does to their operations, I think are doing it. I look at Penn Medicine, and you look at what Kevin Mahoney, the CEO, and Steve Grulich have done. They did the big job up there, IFOA, and they're not going to any other delivery method for the rest of their work. And people said you couldn't do it in Philadelphia. Well, they did, and they've changed the marketplace. But they're definitely collaborative. They're looking at innovation. If you look at the core of that company, it's a top teaching hospital. They're looking to innovate all the way through and drive value. Look, I'm just giving examples of people. This is not an exclusive list. This is some of the people that right. come to my memory at this point in time of this day.
Well,
but there's a lot of good people doing stuff. You just got to be able to.
I mean, that Penn Health was a great representation of a project that even doubled down in design. They stopped design after 18 months and rebooted completely, and still finished within their promised commitment. So it's a pretty remarkable story, and it's a good story to tell. And we just need more places to tell those stories.
But if you look at the fundamental reason it worked, they wanted to mistake-proof healthcare. And they wanted, when they said 500 rooms identical, that meant identical, exactly the same. Now you can fabricate 47 operating rooms, 23 type A and 24 type B. They want to mistake-proof it. So it wasn't 500 rooms, but 100 looked like this and 20 looked like that. And they made them acuity adaptable. So you look at the fundamental way they deliver care, that lines up well to a lean. They have a lean process, and it lines itself up well to lean project delivery.
I think it really talks about the marriage of a lean approach in the business that you're running, and how that relates to the buildings and the facilities that you actually need, and how they should be tied together and not distinct. So one final thing, this is one of the things I've been chasing down for a long time, because I'm fundamentally crazed by the way we design buildings. And I had somebody tell me that when I said we should be designing buildings from the inside out, somebody said, well, we're architects, we just don't put lipstick on a pig. And I'm going, well, maybe you should be putting lipstick on a pig, but as a mechanical, as the guts of the system. And if you think about a theory of constraints, everything constrains it. Every decision you make constrains some other decision you're going to make. So if you decide on the shape of the building first, that constrains your options in terms of the mechanical system and what can be the most effective thing. So I've been pursuing this, advocating this idea that we should designing the systems first in a way that makes them as efficient as possible, and then see how we put the rest of the building around it. Have you seen any of that? Have you seen a movement towards that at all, or am I just kind of completely crazy because I used to be a lawyer and
Yeah, I think you're definitely crazy, but I think
rubbish?
you know, I think part of the stuff here is you got to look at what's the purpose. If this is a project where 70% of the cost is electrical mechanical, which could be a data center, okay, now you might want to think about that a lot more, or maybe it's 60% of the cost. When you're looking at a hospital where 50% of the cost is mechanical, electrical, you might want to think about that manufacturing the same way. When you get to residential or office buildings and we're 15 to 20% of the cost, it doesn't really matter that much. So I think it really comes down to the type of facility you're building and what you're trying to accomplish.
So in Toronto, they built a lot of big giant office buildings that are now sitting vacant, and they're thinking about how do we convert these to residential suites.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, that's mostly a plumbing problem. That the plumbing for an office building doesn't accommodate the plumbing for individual residences like it should. So you got to have a lot more pipes floating around. But it also brings up the question of resiliency. So if we're building if we're thinking about the built environment in general, and not just specific buildings, but how we create buildings and facilities on the face of the earth and how it affects everything else. Is there a component of resilience that we should be looking at? I mean, you're a guru in all this stuff, and you must think about what's the planet going to look like, and why are we doing all the things that we're necessarily doing that are driven by development interests and returns on investment and stuff like that, rather than basically a return on investment to the people who are going to be living in that space.
Yeah, I think resiliency is a broad issue or a broad subject, and there are different perspectives on that. I think from a mechanical perspective, resiliency to me means if something goes wrong, how do you survive? Or if I've got this building, are those systems easy to modify, right? So you might think about things like, how do I heat and cool the building? Well, I can deliver more heat through a pipe, through water, substantially more through water than through air. So if I use if we bring the outside air system, bring the outside air in that's required for humans to be healthy, and then all the other heat we deal with water, that's a little bit more expensive. But you've got a building that's more adaptable, right? Because if I want to increase the load, I bring in some new equipment or whatever it might be, the pipe usually can handle it, right? You can oversize pipe and it's free. I mean, it's not free, but it's relatively cheap. But if I'm going to take a 24-inch duct and make it into 48, that's not simple. You're using spaces. I think there are other design things like, putting your air handler units directly over shafts, not having roof duct, right? Roof duct just leaks. So something's going to happen. Your problems are coming over there. It's not really resilience. It's more like durability. But then there are things that are, how do I adapt the space? I think I'm at the edge of what my brain can handle. This is where you need a real engineer, not me. But I think, we consider it in terms of resiliency. There are requirements in terms of what happens if something happens to the building, what happens if something happens to the grid or the power supply, what happens if the water supply is impacted, what happens if the use of the building changes. And I think sometimes people plan for that, and they spend $2 in cost to prevent a $1 solution that could come later on. So you really want to be smart about this. People talk about future proofing and taking care of building the building for 30 years from now. Hell, we don't know what buildings will look like 10 years from now.
Right.
There'll be new things.
And it's not just mechanical or engineering forces at work, it's social forces as well.
Yep.
That, cities are reconstituting, the nature of work is changing.
Yep.
The things there will be 10 really high paying careers that we can't even imagine right now, 15 years from now.
Yeah.
So it really is, it takes that kind of constant vigilance, right? To be thinking about what we're doing. And it doesn't seem like our ability as like local governments and foreseeability around those things, they seem to not recognize that buildings and facilities are systems, and that the regulatory system is as much an important part of that as everything else, and it has to flow and be as effective and efficient as everything else.
Yeah.
So there's some work to do there, obviously. Any final words of wisdom that you would throw out there to young engineers starting a career as a mechanical engineer?
I think a couple things. Go and learn how work gets done by doing it. It's nice to have theory and pretty software and all these nice things, but go and understand how the people who are installing the work, doing the work, feel, understand their language, understand how they work, understand what frustrates them, and do what you can to make their life better. Because those are the most expensive people that we have in our company, is the people doing the work. How do we support them, particularly in today's environment? How do we make it a safer workplace? How do we mistake-proof it? And then I think secondly is, how do we take people who have typically been overlooked and not been part of our workforce? How do we understand how to bring them into the workforce? How do we understand the value they can bring? And how do we create an environment in which they can thrive? Because I still think we're ignoring parts of our population that have an awful lot to offer. And it's a challenging problem to solve. There's a political aspect, there's a popularity aspect, and then there's a practical aspect. And if you solve the practical aspect, it'll be sustainable. And there's a lot of, in my own experience, there's a lot of people who have typically not been heard, who have ways to solve problems that we haven't thought of. And you got to give them a chance.
And I think that the pressure caused by disparity of income and disparity of opportunity cries out for a solution like that, a much more inclusive, innovative solution. Recognize the value that everybody brings to the table without isolating or stereotyping a certain kind of person that you want in your workforce. The more diverse, the better.
And the way you bring them in is into an IFOA type of contract. You bring them in on best value selection. You don't pick them by low price and in an adversarial manner. You bring people into an environment where they can contribute, and it's people and companies. So workforce development is very important for us. Underutilized business enterprises. That's a key part of the future, I think, and owners are recognizing it. And some are doing it very wisely.
This has been great. I've taken more of your time than I had promised you, but it's been really valuable. It's been terrific. So thanks, Victor, and good luck out there, my friend.
Thanks, Dick. I appreciate it, and glad you're recovering well from your surgery.
I'm trying.
There you go, man.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lean Construction Blogs podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help us spread the word by sharing, subscribing, or leaving a review on your preferred podcast listening platform. Remember to join us next time as we continue to lower the barriers to applying lean construction and help take your lean journey to the next level. And don't forget to visit the Lean Construction blog to stay up to date on our latest podcast episodes, weekly blog posts, monthly webinars, and upcoming conferences. We hope to see you on the next episode.